What does it mean when a city built on movement suddenly goes quiet? For decades, New York sold itself as a machine that never stopped. Trains every few minutes, platforms packed with bodies. The constant friction of human presence proving that the city was alive, necessary, unstoppable. But today, beneath the noise of Times Square and the glow of curated skylines, something unsettling is happening. Entire stations sit nearly empty, not temporarily, not during off hours, empty in a way that feels deliberate, abandoned, quietly erased. This isn't about convenience or changing habits. It's about absence. And absence in a city like New York is never neutral. If people stop passing through certain spaces, it's not because they forgot them. It's because something pushed them away. Fear, cost, exhaustion, or the slow realization that being there no longer makes sense. These empty stations aren't accidents of infrastructure. They are symptoms, warnings embedded into concrete, steel, and silence. The unsettling part isn't that 9 stations are empty. It's that almost nobody is surprised. New York was designed to compress millions of lives into motion. The subway wasn't just transportation, it was the circulatory system of the urban dream. Live anywhere, work everywhere. Opportunity was always one stop away. When stations lose relevance, it means entire neighborhoods have slipped out of the city's economic and social bloodstream. They still exist on the map, but not in daily life. And that's where the real crisis begins. An empty station signals more than low ridership. It reflects people who can't afford to stay, can't justify commuting, can't tolerate the daily psychological toll anymore. It reflects jobs that vanished, rents that exploded, safety that eroded, and trust that quietly collapsed. The city didn't explode. It hollowed out. What makes this more disturbing is how normalized it has become. A locked gate, a dark platform, a station that looks operational but feels erased. No press conferences, no urgency, just quiet acceptance. New York isn't announcing a collapse. It's letting it happen unnoticed. These stations are not failures of design. They are mirrors. They show what happens when a city prioritizes image over livability, extraction over stability, survival over dignity. When movement becomes optional because life itself becomes unsustainable. And this silence underground is only the beginning. Because if the place is meant to move people stop working, the question isn't where everyone went. It's why they no longer belong. Before we talk about which stations emptied out, we need to understand what kind of city creates emptiness without admitting loss. If this feels uncomfortable, that reaction matters. These empty stations aren't just urban trivia. They're signals of something deeper breaking beneath everyday life. Understanding what's really happening requires attention, not scrolling past the discomfort. If you've ever felt the tension of a city that promises everything but delivers exhaustion, say it out loud in the comments. Right, the city is hollowing out, so this conversation doesn't stay buried. If this analysis is helping you see New York and modern cities were eerie with clearer eyes, support the work by leaving a like and subscribing. That simple action tells the algorithm this kind of honest, critical content deserves to be seen, not buried like the spaces we're talking about. What makes these stations unsettling is not that they failed, it's that they were never officially declared dead. In New York, nothing truly closes. It just stops being acknowledged. The lights remain on, the signage stays in place. Maps still include the stops. On paper, everything functions. In reality, almost nobody enters. This quiet abandonment is far more revealing than a dramatic shutdown because it exposes how decline actually works in modern cities, invisibly, bureaucratically, without ceremony. These stations weren't destroyed by a single disaster or a headline-grabbing event. They were drained, slowly. Rent increases pushed residents out block by block. Jobs relocated or vanished. Safety deteriorated just enough to make daily use feel risky, but not enough to trigger emergency declarations. Over time, fewer people needed these stations, and even fewer felt safe or motivated to use them. Here's the critical insight most narratives avoid. Abandonment is not random. It follows economics. Pressure. When a station empties, it usually means the surrounding area has crossed an invisible threshold. The point where commuting no longer connects you to opportunity, but to stress. Where living nearby no longer feels strategic, only exhausting. People don't leave all at once. They leave one lease at a time, one eviction notice at a time, one "this isn't worth it anymore" moment at a time. Around these stations, small businesses disappear first, then services, then foot traffic. The streets don't explode into chaos, they thin out. Fewer faces, shorter operating hours, longer waits for everything that still exists. The city doesn't collapse loudly, it withdraws. Every 300 feet of unused platform tells a human story that never makes it into transit reports. Someone who used to swipe a Metro card there now works remotely from another state. Someone else moved in with family because rent doubled. Someone else stayed, but reorganized their life to avoid public transit entirely. Each choice feels individual. Together they create emptiness, and emptiness feeds on itself. A station with fewer riders feels less safe. A station that feels unsafe repels riders. Maintenance gets deprioritized. Staffing is reduced. The environment decays just enough to confirm everyone's fear that they shouldn't be there. This is not neglect, it's a feedback loop. What's disturbing is how easily this process hides behind the language of optimization and efficiency. Resources are reallocated. Usage metrics are reviewed. Nothing sounds alarming. Yet entire zones of the city quietly fall out of circulation, like organs receiving less blood, but never officially declared non-functional. This is how New York avoids admitting loss. The city keeps the infrastructure standing so it can pretend the promise still exists, even when the people who needed it most are gone. Abandonment without acknowledgement becomes policy by default. And once you understand this pattern, you start noticing it everywhere, not just underground, but in neighborhoods, schools, hospitals, and public spaces that technically exist, but no longer serve real life. The question isn't why these stations are empty. The question is how many others are on the same path, and how long the city can keep pretending they're still alive. If you want to understand the real state of New York, don't look at skyline photos or economic headlines. Look at the subway. It has always been the city's most honest instrument. For over a century, the subway wasn't just a way to move people. It was a social contract. It told residents that distance didn't matter, that opportunity was shared, that the city would carry you no matter where you started. Every crowded platform was proof that the system still worked, not perfectly, but collectively. When that system begins to empty, the contract quietly dissolves. An empty station is not a transportation issue, it's a trust issue. People stop using public space when they no longer believe it serves them. Fear plays a role, but so does fatigue. Constant delays, unpredictable conditions, the mental tax of hypervigilance. Over time, commuters don't just adjust routes, they redesign their lives to minimize exposure. Different jobs, different hours, different cities. The subway doesn't lose riders overnight. It loses relevance gradually. Here's the turning point most planners avoid naming. When daily movement becomes psychologically expensive, mobility stops being freedom and starts feeling like punishment. You can measure this shift without statistics. You see it in body language. Empty benches that no one trusts enough to sit on. Platforms where people stand far apart, scanning rather than resting. Stations that feel tense even when nothing is happening. The absence of crowds doesn't bring calm, it brings unease. Silence becomes suspicious. Every few hundred words into this story, the same pattern reappears. Normalization. Riders adapt. Authorities adapt. Media reframes. What would have triggered outrage 10 years ago is now treated as background noise. A closed entrance here, a reduced schedule there. Nothing dramatic enough to protest, yet disruptive enough to erode daily life. And this erosion has a direction. It always moves downward. Once a station crosses a certain threshold of underuse, it becomes harder to justify investment. Repairs are delayed. Cleaning becomes irregular. The environment communicates neglect even. before anyone says it out loud. This isn't mismanagement. It's triage. And triage implies scarcity. Someone, somewhere, has already decided which parts of the city are worth saving. This is where the subway stops being infrastructure and becomes a social map. Full stations signal protected zones. Empty ones reveal areas that have fallen out of priority. Not officially abandoned, just quietly deprioritized. The city doesn't announce this hierarchy. It lets commuters feel it, and commuters respond rationally. They avoid what feels unstable. They plan around decay. They internalize the message that certain places are no longer meant for them. Over time, that message spreads upward, shaping how people perceive the entire city. New York still claims to be hyper-connected. But connection without reliability is illusion. Movement without dignity becomes stress. And when the system designed to hold everything together starts losing credibility, people don't rebel. They withdraw. They don't know. Withdrawal doesn't stay underground. It changes where people live, how long they stay, and whether they believe the city has a future that includes them. The subway doesn't just reflect social conditions, it amplifies them. And once it starts signaling exclusion instead of access, the damage moves faster than any train ever could. Because when the city's circulatory system weakens, everything downstream begins to starve. There was a time when New York's subway symbolized upward motion, not just physically, but socially. You could live far, arrive anywhere, and believe that effort would be rewarded. Mobility meant possibility. Today, that promise has inverted. What once represented access now exposes exclusion. The collapse isn't sudden, it's procedural. Stations that once connected people to jobs, schools, and social life now function as reminders of how fragile that connection has become. Missed trains stack into lost hours. Unreliable service turns punctuality into a gamble. Commutes stop being transitions and become endurance tests. The city still moves, but only for those who can afford buffers, flexible jobs, remote options, private transportation. For everyone else, movement becomes punishment. This is where infrastructure failure reveals its true nature. It doesn't trap everyone equally. It sorts. Around this point in the story, the myth cracks. The idea that New York rewards ambition collapses when effort no longer correlates with stability. People can work harder than ever and still lose ground. Longer hours don't buy security. Hustle doesn't offset systemic friction. The city demands more while offering less, and calls it resilience. Here's the unsettling twist. This isn't chaos, it's alignment. A system that extracts maximum value from labor while minimizing long-term responsibility doesn't need to function well, it only needs to function selectively. As long as core zones remain profitable and visible, peripheral breakdown is tolerated. Empty. Stations aren't failures to be fixed. They're acceptable losses. Every few hundred words into this reality, another layer peels back. The decline of mobility reshapes behavior. People stop exploring. They avoid unnecessary trips. Social circles shrink. Cultural participation declines. Life compresses inward. The city becomes something you endure between walls rather than experience between places. And this compression has psychological weight. When movement feels hostile, the mind stays on, alert. Chronic stress becomes baseline. Small disruptions feel catastrophic because there's no slack left. This is how infrastructure failure becomes mental fatigue. Not dramatic, not newsworthy, but relentless. Over time, people don't say, "The system failed me." They say, "I can't keep up." That language matters. It shifts blame inward. The subway once made the city legible. You knew where you were going and how to get there. Now it mirrors uncertainty. Delays without explanations. Closures without timelines. Stations that exist but don't function as promised. The system communicates the same message the city does. Adapt or disappear. And many do disappear, not by vanishing overnight, but by slowly stepping out of the city's rhythm. They move farther. They stay home more. They stop planning long-term. The city doesn't notice each departure because departure has become the norm. This is how the promise of mobility collapses into proof of inequality. Not through spectacle, but through repetition. Not with riots, but with resignation. A transportation system that once unified now divides, and does so quietly enough to avoid accountability. Before we talk about the neighborhoods left behind, it's important to recognize this truth. When a city's infrastructure stops serving ordinary life, it stops being a ladder and becomes a filter. If any part of this resonates, leave a comment with the words, "Mobility is no longer freedom." Saying it matters. When stations empty out, it's tempting to blame individual choices. People moved, habits changed, remote work happened, but that explanation collapses the moment you look at what surrounds these stations. What you find isn't flexibility, it's disconnection. These stations don't sit in thriving neighborhoods that suddenly went digital. They sit in areas where opportunity thinned out long before the platforms did. Jobs left, local commerce weakened, services followed. What remains is a geography that technically exists but no longer participates in the city's daily flow. The station becomes a monument to a life pattern that no longer works. This is where urban decline stops being abstract and becomes spatial. A subway stop is supposed to anchor a neighborhood. It signals access, relevance, inclusion. When that anchor loses purpose, the surrounding area drifts. Not dramatically, incrementally. Fewer reasons to come, fewer reasons to stay. What's left is a community disconnected from the city's promise, even if it's only a few miles away. Here's the critical reversal most people miss. Infrastructure doesn't die because neighborhoods fail. Neighborhoods fail because infrastructure withdraws meaning. Once a station becomes unreliable or unsafe feeling, daily life reorganizes around avoidance. Residents time their days differently. Parents change routes. Workers look for alternatives that cost more but feel less risky. Over time, only those with no options remain dependent on a system that no longer serves them well. The city doesn't abandon them outright. It lets inconvenience do the work. Every 300 to 400 words into this reality, another uncomfortable truth surfaces. Disconnection compounds inequality. Areas with active stations attract investment, attention, and policing for protection. Areas with empty stations attract neglect, surveillance for control, or nothing at all. This isn't an accident. It's a sorting mechanism disguised as logistics. And once disconnection sets in, it spreads. Empty stations discourage movement, which discourages commerce, which discourages maintenance, which reinforces emptiness. What starts as underuse becomes stigma. Nobody goes there. There's nothing there. It's not worth it. Language shifts, and with it, perception. The neighborhood fades from the mental map of the city long before it disappears from the physical one. What makes this especially damaging is the lack of an exit narrative. There's no recovery plan residents can believe in, no timeline, no acknowledgement, just the quiet understanding that the city has moved on without saying goodbye. People aren't angry because anger requires visibility. They're tired. This fatigue reshapes identity. Residents stop seeing themselves as New Yorkers in the full sense. They feel peripheral, tolerated rather than included. That psychological shift is devastating because cities don't just function on infrastructure, they function on belonging. When belonging erodes, participation follows. And this is why empty stations matter more than boarded-up storefronts or declining foot traffic. They represent the breaking point where a neighborhood loses its connective tissue. Where being in New York no longer means being part of New York. The city doesn't collapse all at once. It fragments, block by block, station by station. Walking through an empty station doesn't feel neutral. It feels wrong in a way that's hard to explain unless you've experienced it. These spaces were designed for density, noise, friction, and movement. When they lose that purpose, the absence becomes heavy, not peaceful, unsettling. The human brain reads emptiness differently when it appears where crowds are expected. Silence in a forest can calm you. Silence underground, in a city built on constant motion triggers vigilance. People don't relax. They scan. They shorten their steps. They avoid eye contact. The station may be structurally intact, but psychologically, it broadcasts abandonment. This is where the crisis stops being about infrastructure and becomes about mental survival. Cities condition people to accept stress as the price of opportunity. But when stress no longer leads anywhere, when movement doesn't improve life, it mutates into anxiety. Empty stations amplify this feeling. They signal that the system isn't just strained, it's receding. And when public space recedes, people internalize the message that they're on their own. Every few hundred words into this reality, the emotional cost deepens. Commuters begin to plan their lives around avoidance rather than participation. They memorize which entrances feel safer, which platforms to skip, which hours to disappear. The city becomes something to navigate defensively instead of inhabit fully. That shift quietly erodes mental health. What's especially corrosive is how quickly this state becomes normal. People stop talking about it because talking doesn't change anything. They adapt instead. They lower expectations. They accept discomfort as baseline. Over time, the abnormal becomes familiar, and familiarity is mistaken for stability. This is how psychological collapse hides inside routine. The presence of others used to act as a stabilizer. Crowds meant witnesses. Shared space meant shared responsibility. Empty stations remove that buffer. Isolation sets in even when you're technically in public. You're seen less. Help feels farther away. Small incidents feel larger because there's no collective energy to absorb them. And this doesn't stay underground. The stress carried through these spaces follows people home, to work, into relationships. Chronic alertness drains patience. It shortens tempers. It narrows empathy. A city that forces its residents into constant low-level defense creates a population that is exhausted but still expected to perform. Here's the reorientation few are ready to admit. Many people aren't leaving New York because they failed. They're leaving because their nervous systems can't sustain the conditions anymore. Empty stations are one of the clearest indicators of that limit being reached. When spaces meant to serve millions start feeling hostile to the few who remain, something fundamental has broken. Not loudly, not officially, but deeply. And this raises a question most discussions avoid. If daily movement itself becomes a source of psychological harm, what kind of life is the city really offering now? If you've ever felt this kind of quiet stress in public spaces, leave a comment with, "The city feels heavy." Shared language makes invisible pressure visible. New York still sells itself as a global destination, but the illusion starts cracking the moment visitors move below the surface. Tourism depends on choreography. Airports impress, landmarks dazzle, curated routes guide people through polished corridors of the city. But the subway doesn't perform. It exposes. And when tourists encounter empty or decaying stations, the shock isn't about inconvenience, it's about contradiction. This isn't the city they were promised. For decades, New York's global image relied on density as proof of importance. Crowds meant relevance. Movement meant energy. But empty stations flip that signal. They suggest withdrawal. Not just of people, but of confidence. Visitors sense it immediately, even if they can't articulate why. Every few hundred words into this story, the tension sharpens. Tourism amplifies. Decline faster than residents do. Locals normalize dysfunction because survival requires adaptation. Tourists don't adapt, they compare. They notice the broken escalators, the closed entrances, the lack of staff, the uneasy quiet. And they carry that perception home. This matters because reputation is infrastructure now. A city can survive short-term neglect if belief remains intact. Once belief erodes, recovery becomes exponentially harder. Empty stations tell a story of abandonment that no marketing campaign can fully erase. They suggest a city that still charges premium prices but no longer delivers premium safety, efficiency, or care. Here's the uncomfortable pivot. Tourism doesn't just reveal decline, it accelerates it. As visitors reroute away from certain areas, businesses follow. Investment narrows to a few safe zones. The city doubles down on protecting the image rather than repairing the system. Resources concentrate. Peripheral spaces are quietly written off. The subway, once a democratizing force, becomes a liability to be managed rather than a promise to be fulfilled. This creates a split reality. Above ground, the city performs confidence. Below ground, it leaks truth. Empty stations become symbolic border zones, places where the global city ends and the neglected city begins. They're not meant to be seen, but they're impossible to hide. Every international traveler who stumbles into one becomes an unintentional witness. And the psychological effect is contagious. If outsiders can see the cracks, residents feel them more acutely. The question shifts from "is this temporary?" to "why are we pretending this is normal?" That doubt spreads faster than Decay ever could. Tourism used to reinforce New York's myth. Now, it pressures it. Each disappointed visitor is a reminder that the city's problems are no longer local, no longer deniable, no longer invisible. And when a global city loses control of its narrative, it doesn't just lose prestige. It loses leverage. Because the moment the world stops believing in the promise, the cost of maintaining the illusion becomes unsustainable, financially, politically, and socially. What makes this situation endure isn't ignorance, it's refusal. Almost everyone involved knows these stations are empty. Transit authorities track usage. City planners see the maps. Local officials receive reports. Journalists pass through the same spaces. And yet, there is no moment of collective admission. No statement that says something fundamental has broken. Instead, there is careful language, selective framing, and strategic silence. This is how decline survives in plain sight. In New York, acknowledging loss carries risk. It threatens property values, political credibility, institutional legitimacy, and the mythology that keeps the city attractive to capital. So the problem isn't denied outright, it's fragmented. Each empty station is treated as an isolated anomaly, a temporary dip, a localized issue, never part of a pattern. Every 300 to 400 words into this reality, the same defensive reflex appears. Normalization through repetition. When people see dysfunction often enough without acknowledgement, they stop expecting resolution. The abnormal becomes routine. Silence becomes policy. And the absence of outrage is mistaken for stability. This is where collective denial turns corrosive. Residents feel the disconnect between lived experience and official narrative. They know something is wrong, but nothing in the public discourse reflects it. That gap creates cognitive dissonance. People begin to doubt their own perception. Maybe it's just me. Maybe this is how cities are now. That quiet self-gaslighting is one of the most effective tools of systemic decay. Institutions benefit from this ambiguity. As long as no one names the collapse, no one is accountable for stopping it. Empty stations don't require emergency funding. They don't trigger reforms. They simply exist, unclaimed, unexplained, ignored. The city continues operating as if circulation still flows evenly, even when entire veins have gone cold. And culture reinforces the silence. Admitting that New York is failing contradicts decades of identity building. The city is supposed to be resilient, invincible, eternal. To question that feels almost taboo, so people joke instead. They cope. They lower expectations. Humor replaces protest. Irony replaces action. This is not apathy. It's adaptation. Under constraint. But denial has a cost. When systems decay without acknowledgement, the damage compounds. Small failures stack into structural ones. Trust erodes. Participation drops. People disengage not because they don't care, but because caring feels futile. The city doesn't lose them dramatically. It loses them psychologically first. Empty stations are physical evidence of that withdrawal. They show what happens when a population stops believing that speaking up leads anywhere. When silence feels safer than honesty, when endurance replaces hope. The most dangerous phase of collapse isn't chaos, it's consensus, the quiet agreement to look away. And once a city reaches that point, the question is no longer whether problems will surface. It's whether anyone will still recognize them as problems when they do. At this stage, it becomes impossible to pretend this is only about transportation. Empty stations are not the problem. They are the evidence. The real crisis is what they imply about daily life in the city above them. When infrastructure empties, it usually means life has become too expensive, too unstable, or too psychologically draining to sustain normal routines. People don't abandon essential systems casually. They do it when participation starts to cost more than it gives back. In New York, that threshold has been crossed quietly. The cost of living isn't just high, it's hostile. Rent consumes disproportionate income. Commuting steals hours of unpaid time. Basic services demand constant negotiation. Every decision requires calculation. Can I afford this? Is this safe? Is this worth the stress? Over time, life stops being lived and starts being managed. Empty stations are a byproduct of that shift. They mark where everyday life became impractical. Every 300 to 400 words into this reality, a deeper truth surfaces. Cities don't collapse when people suffer. They collapse when people disengage. Disengagement doesn't look dramatic. It looks like fewer trips, shorter routes, avoidance, staying home, declining invitations, turning down opportunities that require crossing the city, life contracts. The subway, once a tool of expansion, becomes a reminder of friction. And friction, repeated daily, reshapes behavior more effectively than any policy. This is where the human cost hides. Stress becomes chronic, not episodic. Anxiety becomes environmental. People live in a constant state of readiness without a clear threat, a classic recipe for burnout. Empty stations reflect that burnout. They show where the city has lost the capacity to carry its people without injuring them. What makes this especially dangerous is how normalized it feels. Struggle is reframed as toughness. Endurance is praised. If you can't keep up, the implication is personal failure. This narrative protects the system by redirecting blame inward. People don't demand change, they question themselves. But no individual coping strategy can fix a structural problem. When entire transit nodes fall silent, it means large numbers of people have already decided that the system doesn't serve them anymore. Some leave the city, others stay but withdraw from public life. Both outcomes hollow the urban fabric. The city may still look dense, but participation thins. And thinning participation has consequences. Fewer riders justify fewer investments. Fewer investments accelerate decay. Decay reinforces avoidance. The cycle tightens. At no point does anyone need to declare an emergency. The collapse advances through reasonable decisions made in isolation. This is why empty stations matter more than crime statistics or economic reports. They capture behavior, not opinion. They show what people actually do when the city becomes unlivable. They opt out where they can. And once opting out becomes rational, the idea of urban life as opportunity collapses. What remains is survival inside a system that still charges premium prices for diminishing returns. If you've ever felt like simply existing in a city required constant effort with little reward, leave a comment with, "Survival mode isn't living." Shared recognition is the first crack in normalization. There is a moment in every system when decline stops being reversible and starts becoming self-sustaining. Not because no one cares anymore, but because too many people have quietly adapted to less. Empty stations mark that moment for New York. At first, these places felt temporary, a dip in usage, a post-crisis anomaly, a phase. Then they became familiar. Then they became invisible. That progression matters because cities don't fail when they lose resources, they fail when they lose urgency. When a society stops treating absence as alarming, absence becomes permanent. What we're witnessing isn't the death of a city. It's something more subtle and more dangerous, the erosion of expectation. New York still functions, but at a lower standard that would have been unacceptable a decade ago. The trains still run, just not reliably. The stations still exist, just not for everyone. The promise still circulates, just not evenly. This is how the myth survives even as the experience collapses. The city doesn't need to work well. It only needs to work enough to keep the narrative alive. Every few hundred words into this realization, a final shift emerges. The city's symbols start failing simultaneously. Transportation weakens, housing fractures, public trust thins. The airport feels chaotic. The commute feels punitive. The streets feel tense. None of this alone signals collapse. Together, they do. Empty stations are not the cause of this crisis. They are the proof that the flow has already broken. And here's the critical point most discussions avoid. Once flow dies, recovery is no longer about repair. It's about reinvention. Systems built for density, optimism, and upward mobility cannot simply be patched when those conditions disappear. They either transform or they continue extracting value from fewer people until even that becomes impossible. This is why denial is so costly. By refusing to name the collapse, the city delays the only conversation that could change its trajectory. Instead of asking, what kind of city do we want now, it keeps pretending to be the city it used to be. Empty stations sit there as quiet accusations, reminding anyone willing to notice that the old formula no longer works. And the danger isn't that New York will empty out overnight. It's that it will keep hollowing itself slowly, charging more, offering less, and calling endurance success. That model can persist longer than people expect, but not forever. When circulation stops, when trust erodes, when participation drops below a critical mass, even the strongest myths fail. Not with explosions, with silence. And that silence is already here, underground, waiting to be acknowledged. If you're still watching, leave a comment with, "The myth is cracking, so this conversation doesn't end in silence too." If you stayed until the end, it means you felt that something here connects to your own experience, or to a city you once believed in. That matters. This channel exists to expose what gets normalized, ignored, and quietly accepted. If this video helped you see New York, or urban life itself, more clearly, take 1 second to subscribe. That's how this kind of analysis survives in a system that prefers silence. Leave a like if you believe cities should be measured by human livability, not marketing slogans. And most importantly, leave a comment. Write exactly this. The myth is cracking. It tells the algorithm, and other viewers, that this conversation is real, not entertainment. Now, watch the next video appearing on your screen. What we uncover there goes even deeper into how modern cities reach the breaking point without ever announcing it.